Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the latest INS online seminar. My name is Oisin Plum. You will notice that I am not Andrew Lind, your usual host. I am stepping in for him this evening, and what a great session to be stepping into. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Davide Zori, who is going to be speaking to us today. Just before I introduce him and invite him to take the metaphorical floor, just want to remind you, you may have seen a notice ping up reminding you that this session is going to be recorded. So please be aware of that. Make sure if you do not wish to be recorded, make sure that your camera is off, which I think it is by default anyway, and make sure your microphone is off as well. After the paper, there will be an opportunity for questions, and you really have two options for that. If you would like to ask a question verbally, please use the raise hand function you could see at the top of your Teams screen. If you would prefer to type a question, then please do so in the chat. Now, I can see there's a message here in the chat saying that you can't hear anything. Can I please just ask somebody to confirm that you can hear me? Excellent. Thank you very much. That's wonderful. So, without further ado, I will introduce our speaker. So, Dr. Zori teaches in the Baylor Interdisciplinary Core and is affiliated faculty of the Department of History. Zori's research concentrates on the medieval world, with research foci on the Viking expansion into the North Atlantic and the widespread 8th to 12th century phenomenon of Italian population movements onto defended hilltops. He employs a multidisciplinary approach to the Middle Ages, combining material culture and written evidence. He conducts archaeological fieldwork in Iceland, addressing the interaction of the Norse settlers with new environments and construction of a migrant society and the subsequent evolution of endemic political systems. As a director of the San Giuliano Archaeological Research Project, he has been leading excavations of an Etruscan necropolis and a medieval castle complex in central Italy. So, a fabulously interesting CV, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing what he has to say. So, would you please welcome Dr. Davide Zori?
Thank you, Ocean. I first I need to figure out how to share this presentation again. So you can't see my presentation now, can you?
Yes, we can see the sort of interface behind the scenes screen now,
Behind the
not the full
scenes.
screen.
Okay. Let me try to change
Yep,
that part.
that's full screen now for us.
Is that full
Yeah,
screen?
that's perfect.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you. Thank you again. Thank you also to Andrew Lind, who's not here, and to the entire Institute for Northern Studies. I'm really happy, pleased to be here. Thank you for this opportunity to talk to you this evening. My only regret is that I can't be there in person. That's maybe next time for that. As Osin introduced, I have an eclectic research agenda that splits between Italy and Denmark. My father's Italian, my mother's Danish, so that gives some explanation to that. But most of my work has been in the North Atlantic, has been on the Vikings, which is the topic of my talk today. And I just published a book last year on the Vikings that I'll talk more about. So that's one of the occasions for this. And I'll just be giving a little case study from one of the chapters today um, that I hope will let you see a little bit into the goals of the book, but also maybe talk generally about the Icelandic settlement, the settlement of the North Atlantic, and the challenges and opportunities that the Vikings faced in the North Atlantic. So, as I'm sure you're all aware, the Viking Age roughly 790 to 1100, depending on whether you're a historian or an archaeologist. You might date them slightly differently, but it's a period of vast change, both in Scandinavia and beyond in the Vikings or the Scandinavians of the Viking Age. I'll use the shorthand Vikings for most of the talk today. Had a great impact on the world, and even today in Scandinavia, it's sort of viewed as a little bit of a golden age, a past where the Scandinavians had more impact on the world. The map that you're seeing here shows some of those areas that the Scandinavians impacted. Lots of changes. For instance, they had a role to play in the founding of the Rus state in what's today Russia and Ukraine. And they impacted Francia in ways that some people have even said helped to generate the feudal situation and the breakdown of political centralization under the Carolingians. In Britain, we have, in the beginning of the Viking Age, several Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. At the end, there's only Wessex left. And then from Wessex, we have a united England emerging. I don't have to tell you all the impact on Scotland and the Northern Isles north of Britain, but also into Ireland. Well, Sinai, I gather, is heritage is from at least. There is still debate about the impact of the Vikings on the founding of the trading sites. So even places like Dublin and Wexford and Waterford that emerged during this period, there seem to have been Scandinavians involved, probably tying what we call the Northern Arc of Trade that goes from all the way from the west to Ireland, England, Francia, through the Baltic Sea and down the rivers of the Volga and the Dnieper down to the Baltic or down to the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. And then the impact on the North Atlantic, which will be our focus today, is the settlement, peaceful settlement of uninhabited, largely at least, mostly uninhabited islands in the North Atlantic. So, also internally in Scandinavia, many changes happened. In the beginning of the Viking Age, there were no cities. At the end of the Viking Age, you have the emergence of towns. In the beginning of the Viking Age, we have a pre-Christian culture and religion. By the time the Viking Age ends, we have Christianized kingdoms led by kings that rule over states. So we have a shift also politically from a chieftain level society to, anthropologically speaking, to state level societies. Tons of changes there. Let me go to the next slide here. So the catalyst for all this, different pulls and pushes that bring different Scandinavians out. It might be anything from seeking wealth to seeking new land, maybe even connecting to ideological interests in the afterlife. And if you die with a sword in your hand, you have a greater chance of joining Odin's Einherja in Asgard. So the push and pulls are manifold. But the catalyst in my mind, what allows it all to happen is the Viking ship. The Viking ship with a mast and a sail on it. Without that, they're not going across these vast differences. And I love this image here. It's from one of the picture stones in Gotland, one of the first images we have of the sail. There's still a debate exactly when the technological advantage comes about to put the sail on top of the essentially the Viking boat, which had an independent evolution for many centuries before. But it must have been sometime in the 8th century. Uh, the fact that we don't know is a good entry point into uh, my book, which is called The Age of Wolf and Wind: Voyages through the Viking World, published last year, as you can see down there in the bottom. And my sort of methodological premise here is that for this period, the Viking period, which is a proto-historic period, we really need interdisciplinary archaeology to make any advances at this point. What do I mean by proto-historic? Well, it's a period where we don't have hardly any, a few rune stones, uh, from the Scandinavian perspective itself, but not very much writing during the Viking Age itself coming from Scandinavia. Instead, we rely on texts from those who were affected by the Vikings and Well, that wasn't always a positive experience for them, so they have a biased view of the Vikings, so we have to beware of that. Then we have a massive corpus of later literature from Scandinavia, Iceland, that talks about the Viking Age, but does so after Christianization and several hundred years later. Those are the Icelandic sagas. None of these, and then of course there's archaeology on top of that. And then recently, the last 10 years, there's been a really flowering of analytical sciences, field sciences that we can apply to the past. Everything from ancient genetics to isotopic studies of human bone and teeth. Putting all these different data sets together is a challenge. None of them are perfect. And that's the challenge that I sort of take in this book, the methodological challenge. How to do archaeology, written sources, and lab sciences together in a way that treats them all equally. And what I suggest is that we shouldn't at all exclude any part of these, and we should be open first to analyzing each one separately before we try to put them together. And when we do it in that way, we can create really interesting entanglements and intersections between these stories. And they lead to three different C's, like on the three C's in the book. So confirmation, contradiction, and complementarity. That is when these sources, when these data sets confirm each other. Originally, antiquarian archaeology was interested in this. You take the book, you go for a walk, you find a place where the book seems to describe, you have some archaeology, dig a hole, you find something, and it must be what you read about in the text. Clearly, we're past that. But sometimes you can find confirmation between these sources. Sometimes the sources will contradict each other. And what's probably the most interesting is when they're complementary, when the written sources will give you one window and the archaeology will give you another, and then the data sciences will give you a third. And it allows for a more complete picture. And sometimes they can check each other. So that's what I'd like to keep that in mind as we go through the rest of the lecture today, is I'll look for these arenas of confirmation, contradiction, and complementarity as we look at specific examples. Back to the Viking expansion into the North Atlantic. I said that they were mostly uninhabited landscapes there. It could be that there were some Irish monks in Iceland. At least the texts tell us that. We have no archaeology and no science that tells us that. So that seems to be at least some contradiction there in terms of Iceland. Iceland is the best example that we have. It's the largest island. It's three-fourths the size of the island of Britain. Of course, it's not all inhabitable, but it's a massive space. We have great archaeology, excellent written sources from here, and good science. So this is probably the best island for us to look, and that's why we'll focus in on Iceland rather than the Faroe Shetland or Greenland or even Lanza Meadows, which are also very interesting cases, and I deal with them in the book. But Iceland is our topic for today, and I want to frame it with another more theoretical perspective, and that is in in these migrations, they were creating at the time diasporic societies. A lot has been written on diaspora, peoples, migrations, and societies. Recently, Judith Jesh has a nice book on Viking diaspora into the North Atlantic. And diasporas typically they those who theorize about them talk about the creation of links, special links back to the homeland that these diaspora societies have. Of course, they're different, but they're kind of nostalgic, always looking back and linking to it. It's important for the perpetuation of their society to look back to the homelands. Another interesting perspective was offered by Richard Thomason, a sociologist, decades back now, who described societies such as Iceland, but also the United States, right, where I'm at today in Texas, as new societies. That is, societies that were torn from Europe at a particular moment and that have cultural foci from the moment of their migration. But these new societies, not only do they have that focus on one particular period in the past, but they also have a specific focus on distinguishing themselves from the homeland. that is making themselves distinct. So you have what I'd like to offer is that we can look at these societies as being torn in two directions, one distinguishing and one linking. So also as we progress through these examples today, I'll be looking for those arenas of of contradiction and complementarity and confirmation, but I'll also be looking for those times with the societies, we can see it in the text and archaeology, as creating links to the homelands and distinguishing from the homelands. Now, another thing to think about here is diasporic societies typically have a very distinct relationship to the host society that they move into. Here, you might be thinking of Jewish societies in Europe or even in the United States that have a specific relationship to the host. There is no host in the North Atlantic, no human host at least. But what I would suggest is the host here, we can see it as the environment. We have very interesting interactions between humans and the environment as the Viking Age settlers navigate these diasporic new society challenges. Okay, so moving on to some more clear examples, perhaps. If you think about Iceland, uh, Iceland offers a lot of opportunities. It's a massive landmass. There are some really nice valleys with grazing lands, but it also offers some real constraints. It is colder in Iceland, and the soils are lighter, and the winter comes faster than in the homelands in Scandinavia. This is going to present a challenge. There are icebergs floating around. This far to get back home. There are strange things like geothermal activity, which is very nice because you can create hot tubs, but it also can be dangerous because that volcano can explode and then it can deposit ash over your home field, and that's it for your animals. So we can say this about Iceland: it's a land of paradoxes, of opportunities, and of constraints. In Iceland, they have a nice turn of phrase. It's called gluggaveður. When glugga is a window, weather is the weather. Essentially, it means you look outside and it looks nice out of your window, but you go outside and it's miserable. Okay, so this is a nice kind of analogy for how Iceland can be. Sometimes it looks very tempting, but when you get there, it can be a challenge. So they have to adapt. One quick example of a link to the old ways of doing things from their homelands is they're building turf structure, building houses that look like the houses in their homelands, especially internally. But they're adapting to the new land by building an outer shell of turf. So in the interactions with the new environment, they have to adapt what's essentially a Viking age farm house structure to fit this new environment. This here is a map of all the settlements that are known from the Book of Settlements. It's an Icelandic source that tells us where people settled and the name of their farmstead. It's one of the marvelous things about the archaeology in Iceland. We actually have the names of many. So if you're a place name scholar, it's a great place to work because the farms today still carry the names of the farms recorded in Landnámabók. That's the Book of Settlements. And we have 430 of these sites mentioned. As you see in this map here, it's coastal, right? So the internal part of Iceland is a volcanic desert. You cannot live there. There are some little valleys that stretch in a bit, but not many. And the settlement pattern is one of dispersed individual farmsteads, no towns. So they're setting up a very conservative society that harkens back to the earlier period in the Viking Age. No towns are going to emerge, partially because of the environment, partially for, in my opinion, their conservative choices. They're going to be very conservative in general in Iceland because they don't have much wiggle room for survival. Within within that conservatism, there's going to be chances for innovation, of course, like with the turf house, using the natural environment to build a well-insulated house surrounded by turfs. They've pretty quickly, within 60 years, Iceland settled in 870, and by 930, they established an Althing, that's a island-wide parliament. And this builds on the assemblies that the Vikings had back at home in Scandinavia, but it extends it to in a certain way that it almost seems like a national consciousness. I mean, it's not a nation state yet, and nationalism, has to wait many years, but they have an idea that to be Icelandic is something different. And to be Icelandic is confined by this island. And they divide that island into four different regions, and each region has a separate governing structure, which I'll say more about in a second. But each year they meet at Thingvellir, and it means thing plains or assembly plains, and they meet there for just over a week and make laws, solve disputes, exchange information. So it's tremendous, actually, that within 60 years, this culture sets up a site like this and develops a unique identity. Again, separate from, if we want to think back to to Thomason's idea of new societies, separate from their homelands. But if you think in a diasporic way, also similar to what was going on in the homelands. It's similar except for one thing. They know they don't want any kings. So kings were a factor in Scandinavia, and they decide no kingship is to exist. Now I want to another arrow is going to pop up here. This is a risbru. So once I've just finished with the general overview, I'll pop in and we'll talk specifically about my field work in the Mosfell Valley, where the site of risbru is located. So again, they don't have a king. They have a law speaker who's appointed for 3 years. One every year, the law speaker is supposed to recite a third of the laws. It's an oral culture. The law speaker role rotates around between the chieftains of the polity of Iceland, but he doesn't have any more executive power than anyone else. So in an American sense, they have legislative power, they have a judiciary system, but they don't have an executive. Here is another way to view the governmental system and structure that they begin in Iceland. So these little black dots are thingmen. Those are free farmers that have a particular relationship, being in thing. They're political supporters of a chieftain. And there's a set number of chieftains, although there's some flexibility there, but there's supposed to be a set number of chieftains. And these two social roles, the free farmers and the chieftains, become the focus, really the political focus and the economic focus of the Icelandic polity. Each year, those chieftains and their supporters go to regional things. So all those larger circles, Mula thing, Skaftafelds thing, here that I'm pointing to, Sunadal's thing, those are regional things that are assemblies that happen in the local areas. They try to solve disputes just like the larger thing, but they don't make laws. Any dispute that can't be solved there is brought to the Althing, which is here at the center. So a new political system based on old models, but something very distinct from the homelands. Thinking back again on Thomason's idea of something unique to new societies, cultural foci, I think the law is one cultural foci for them. The law separate from kingship, so they don't follow the Scandinavian model. Another focus is saga storytelling. We know already from the Viking Age that Icelanders were famous for their storytelling at the courts of kings in Norway and Denmark and even beyond. And it's always been a bit of a mystery, but perhaps not, that the sagas, those textual sources that tell us about the Scandinavian Viking Age and the Middle Ages, are largely created and preserved in Iceland. So the Icelandic sagas are the largest corpus of vernacular medieval literature that we have, and they deal with exactly this cultural focus of chieftains and free farmers. They're a great resource. I highly recommend them to anyone who hasn't um, looked into them or read them. So this storytelling becomes one of their foci, I believe, and this would be one of our data sets. So just to give you as a way into to my region, specific region of study, but also to give you some kind of idea of what kind of information you might find in these sagas. Here is a short quote from Eil Saga, and he's a warrior poet that was born in the pagan period and lasts into the close to the Christian period in Iceland. So Iceland converts to Christianity in the year 1000 with some pressure from Norway. But the way they convert is also very telling. They meet at the Althing and decide together. They vote, in a sense. And in order not to be torn apart into two ideological factions, they say we should all be Christian in public, but what people do in their own homes is up to them. And that lasts for at least a while until Christianity takes hold a bit more. But let's take a look at this passage here. When Christianity was adopted by law in Iceland, so now we're right around 1000, Grim of Mosfell was baptized and built a church there. People say the authorities had Eil's bones moved from a pagan burial mound to the church, and this is the evidence. When a church was built at Mosfell, the one Grim had built at Riesbru was demolished and a new graveyard was laid out. There's lots in there. So the area that I work in is called the Mosfell Valley. And it's named here. I'll go to a map of the Mosfell Valley here. It's named for a big mountain which you see to the north, to the at the top of the map here, Mosfell Mountain. It's a big, large landscape feature that you can see from the sea. This mountain gives the name to the valley and to what is probably the main farm originally in the valley. At least that's what the the source here has us believe. There's several chieftains in the sagas that are known to live at Mosfell, and they rule over an area or hold power over an area that stretches almost out to what's today Reykjavik. So if you look at the map down in the lower left here, you'll see what part of Iceland we're in. Reykjavik is just outside of the larger map here as you go towards Reykjanes. So this Leirvogur Bay stretches out towards the sea. And if you were in a Viking ship, you would go in as far as you possibly could into Leirvogur and dock here. And we've done a lot of work looking for the harbor, and we think we've found it now that we also know from the sources that the chieftains controlled. And controlling Viking ships that come in and leave from Iceland is a great source of social power. We won't talk about that today. My focus is on Riesbru. But what I do want to say here is, if we go back now for a moment to this text, uh, we have several place names mentioned here. So in doing archaeology in this interdisciplinary type, I think the place names is one of the things we need to pay more attention to. So it seems to be that a church was built first at this site called Riesbru and then moved to Mosfell. So one question we had very early on is why build a church at Riesbru first? Riesbru is a name that is not very high status name. It's a tertiary name at best. It means reed bridge. It's not named after the big landscape feature. And move it here. There's something that doesn't quite match here with the place names. And typically, the chieftains in Iceland and generally in Scandinavia, when they converted to Christianity, would build their churches so they could control them close to their home farm. So, if we were to look at the modern landscape of the Mosfell Valleys, it's nice and green. There's Mosfell Mountain there in the background. This farm is Riesbru, and it really sits on some of the best farmland in the valley. It's a south-facing slope of the mountain of the valley, and or the northern slope of the valley, the southern slope of the mountain. So you get the most sun and is free of snow the earliest. Mosfell is the next farm over. Mosfell today is where the local church is, but Riesbru really seems to have a commanding position. So the inception of our archaeology project was to investigate a valley and to see if we could see the growth of a social network and structure in this kind of diaspora society within a valley in Iceland. And we chose to focus on the site of Riesbro, partially because we were curious about the way these farm names were used in the saga. Here's an aerial view of Riesbro, and it points there to two features I want to point out. They're the church excavations and Hultuhol. Actually, when we first came there, the church excavations are in a little hill called Kirkjuhol. So there are two hills there, Kirkjuholt and Hultuholt. Kirkjuholt means church hill or church knoll. And because we had a saga that mentions a church, we found that pretty curious. So this is a micro place name held in the memory of the local inhabitants of the valley, not maintained in any other source. And then Hultuholt, which means hill of the hidden people. Just keep that in mind. That's kind of an elven hill. So when we started excavations, we started looking at the church hill, and skip ahead here several years. Underneath that hill, we found a Viking Age church dating from around the year 1000. It's small in scale. You can see here this is about 6 meters from end to end. It's a nave and chancel building, nave here in the west and a chancel in the east. You can just see the remains of sill beams here where wood would have been slotted in. One vertical post was remaining. And around it, we know it's a church based on the form and the orientation, but also is surrounded by burials, which I'll talk about in a bit. So here's the another map of it. Again, it's about 6 meters long, about 2.5 meters wide. It's a classic kind of very early Viking Age church. Small, so you wouldn't be able to fit very many people. Probably not even the whole group of people living at a farmstead would be able to fit inside one of these churches. This is our archaeological team from that year. Built with wood, like I said, on the sides, slotted into the sill beams that we found the remains of. When I was showing this to one of my kids, he said, "Well, it looks like a bike shed." And I was like, "Yeah, okay, well, it does." But if in the Icelandic context, this was actually pretty expensive with this kind of wood that's displayed on the outside. If we look around the church, we see these 26 burials. What I want to point out here is that they're moving people around. People are moving into the graveyard, not by themselves, right, but being moved in. So here you have a bundle of bones here next to the chancel, another one up here. And then you have several graves where it looks like people have been moved out of the graveyard. If we take a look at the human burials around the church, we have evidence of violence. So this is a weapon wound to the back of the head, a bladed weapon wound, and one to the side of the head. Right. Gruesome stuff, but fits with some of our knowledge of the society. And actually, if we go back to the sagas about our site, there is a source which talks about this kind of violence. So I'll just read this out to you. It's from Gunnlaug's saga, and this little snippet is taken from a segment of the saga that talks about the feuding between the people of Mosfell, this valley that we're looking at, and the people of a farm called Gilsbaki in Borgafjörður. If you're familiar with that, Borgafjörður is a fjord to the north. So the people from Gilsbaki have been ridden down and they're attacking Mosfell. In the autumn around the year 1020, so we're 20 years ahead from the earlier source, the chieftain Itlugi rode from his home at Gilsbaki with 30 men and arrived at Mosfell early in the morning. Unun the chieftain there and his sons escaped into the church. But Itlugi caught two of Unun's kinsmen, one named Bjorn and the other Thorgrim. Itlugi had Bjorn killed and Thorgrim's foot chopped off, and then he rode home. So, um, when we found this, people, the lovers of the saga, said, "Well, look, you found Bjorn from the sagas." Now, I would say this is not one of those situations where we can held specific confirmation up, right? So I don't think this is an example of confirmation. This is probably general confirmation of a relatively violent society that experiences these types of feuding events. So I think this is the sagas don't always give you a one-to-one, or you can't always trust them for the historical facts, but the sociological picture is often quite good. I want to go back to Egil's saga uh, one more time. The the part in gray there is what we read before. So I'm just going to expand a little earlier so you see some of the text before and some of the text after. The point is here we're going to continue to probe some correspondence possibilities between text and archaeology. So now we're getting a little bit a backstory on Egil Skallagrimsson, the warrior poet's death. Egil became sick in the autumn, leading to his death. And when he died, Grim dressed Egil in fine clothes, then let him be moved down to Chaltanes, another place name, and made a mound there. And Egil was placed into the mound with his weapons and clothes. And then this part that we've already seen, when Christianity was adopted by law in Iceland, Grim of Mosfell was baptized and built a church there. People say that Thordis had Egil's bones moved from a pagan burial mound to the church, and this is the evidence. When a church was built at Mosfell, the one Grim had built at Risbru was demolished and a graveyard was laid out. Under the altar, some human bones were found, much bigger than ordinary human bones, and people are confident that these were Egil's. Egil's bones were reinterred at the edge of the graveyard at Mosfell. Okay, so we see two movements of this venerable ancestor's bones. He's buried in a pagan mound, then he's moved into a church that they build at a place that is afterwards identified as Risbru, but earlier seems to be Mosfell. Then it's moved to another church at Mosfell. So, okay, just to review in the landscape here. Chaltanes there's a place named Chaltanes in this valley, and there's Risbru and there's Mosfell. So first there's supposed to be a mound down here at Chaltanes, and there's no evidence of any mound there at all. But from there, the remains are supposed to have been moved to Risbru, and then over to the current church of Mosfell. So posthumous movements here. If we're looking at the archaeology, of course, people were curious. Can you see the second movement of Egil? Is there any evidence, if we're going to try to really probe this text, that there was somebody moved into the church? And actually there was. Underneath the chancel where the altar would have stood, there was a grave underneath the altar. So it probably was built, the grave was laid out at the same time or just before this chancel part was built. Not only was it empty, but it was also emptied. From the grave there on top of the chancel, there was a layer of gravel that made the foundation of the floor. That had been dug through in a hole and scattered over the foundations of the church. That was only possible, that would have only been possible if somebody had already moved the superstructure of the church away. So they moved the actual superstructure of the church, the walls and the posts. Then they dug underneath the floor into this grave. Seems to be to remove whatever remains were underneath. So Christians do this, right? They retroactively Christianize people quite frequently, bring people from pagan times into churches. Those of you who are familiar with Denmark, where I'm from, at Jelling, for instance, there's an example of them, Harold Bluetooth moving King Gorm from an earlier mound, probably into the earliest Jelling church. The point there is to establish links to the ancestors, to the venerable ancestors, but also then to Christianize the earlier kings, to make the link across the ideological divide. So we're probably seeing a similar case here at a much smaller scale. So remember, there are people, we know they were reburying folks here because this burial number 4 that you see over on the left is an example of some person who was buried somewhere else and then moved in. In fact, this person was buried with a whalebone amulet with some etchings on it that we haven't been able to decipher, but based on the dating of the bones, they must have come from a pre-Christian graveyard and then moved in. So we have several examples of this kind of retroactive Christianization. So, is this Ale Skallagrimsson's emptied grave? This gentleman here from Iceland clearly thought so. He and so did a lot of local news. To me, you can't say. Well, we can't say. We can't be sure. What we can say is that the text, Ale Saga, tells a similar story as the archaeology does. So we have a general confirmation, but perhaps not a specific one. If you're a real saga romantic, perhaps you go, well, there's too many things that are aligning. This must be Eowl's grave. I'm not willing to go quite that far, but I find the sociological picture in both to be complementary. Want to look at the graves around the chancel because an ideological shift like this to Christianity often leaves a period where people are hedging their bets. We can call it a syncretic period or period of hybridization. And the texts don't tell us anything about that, really. So these are Christian texts that they're shy about that kind of part, pagan traditions slipping in to ritual practices like burial. But archaeology is good at showing us this. So I'll just give you a couple examples. Many of these, no, well, not many, but at least three were buried with objects. So I've already talked about the whalebone. There's a wooden staff, which could be okay with Christianity, but might not be. And then they have a feasting vessel up here buried with one of them. So a big kind of piece of a cauldron. But what I find most fascinating is five different burials. All of them that we could sex were males, so adult males, and they were all buried with um, clinch bolts or ship rivets on top of them. So the wood, of course, was gone, but we found rows of these rivets on top. They're not part of making a coffin. They're not underneath the body, so they're not a bier that they were carrying people in on. There's something else, and what I think they are is pieces of boats. So we know the Vikings' obsession with ships, both in terms of their economics and politics and religious beliefs. And I think this is a reference to ships and or boats as the vehicle that takes you to the next world. And here it is inside of an early Christian graveyard. Now, if we zoom back out, thinking about Christianity and paganism, and thinking about Vikings perhaps being obsessed with ships, remember this other place, Hultuhotl, and of course, as archaeologists, you get curious. The Hultuhot has some stories attached to it. Not only do elven people probably live in there, according to the old tradition, but also there was a taboo about grazing animals there. You weren't supposed to graze animals. You're definitely not supposed to touch it because then the hidden people will cause trouble. So for archaeologists, that's fascinating. So of course, we decided we're gonna probe that. We're going to put a hole in it, which we did in the top. The farmers are kind of watching us, thinking, when are these guys going to drop dead? So far, we've been okay. But the top of the Hultahult is where we chose to excavate, and we also looked around the margins of the hill, which didn't seem totally natural. Here you see it from below. We started to worry about ourselves. Maybe we were becoming obsessed with ships because we saw, okay, is this like a prow of a ship, it was pointing out towards the sea, and we know the chieftains here, according to the text, had a link to the harbor. So when we started the excavation here, first I want to show you here on the left side. There were curbstones placed on the side of the hill, and between the curbstones, they'd filled it up. The curbstones here on the other side, filled it up with gravel. And in this area over here in the middle of the feature, when we dug into that area, we came to a layer about 20 centimeters thick of charcoal and ash, together with objects, artifacts from the Viking Age, including sheets of copper and distinctive Viking Age bead. And burned human remains. So this below is that's a skull fragment, and on the top that's a baby tooth. So there's two individuals represented in here, and we think this is the location of an in situ burning, a cremation grave. Now, this has also generated some pushback, some excitement because it would be the only cremation grave in Iceland. The going hypothesis was that they stopped cremating when they moved to Iceland because of these constraints of the environment. There were not a lot of trees. But our feeling is that at least initially there were trees. And also, even if it's a little more expensive, perhaps the showiness of a cremation would have been worth it if you're making a political statement. Now, another really fascinating story here is carbon dating this deposit. It post dates the year 1000. It post dates some of the burials that are Christian, which to us indicates, well, should indicate in general, that we have a mixed pagan and Christian population living side by side here, which would be possible within the framework of the conversion of Iceland, but one that we haven't really understood. And there might be other stories attached here. This might be I don't know, a period of pagan backlash. You might say, okay, maybe this is, the grumpy grandpa who never converted to Christianity and wanted to go out in the old way. I kind of like that explanation myself. But there's many stories, potential stories here that you can tell. So, looking around, we expect to find some kind of domestic structure as well. And we made some test units here to the north of the church. And after a few years of excavation, you can see here. Well, I might as well give. I think I have some. I don't have a ton of time, but let me just point out this layer. This black layer here is a tephra layer, and once we got under that, that's from 1500. So once we got through that layer, we knew we were in the Viking Age. This picture here shows the us coming down onto a floor layer, very thick floor layer. These are two walls coming on either side. So you can see this, the first trench was here. This is a very large longhouse, 30 meters long, and had two entrances. You'd enter in from the top here, and you enter into a storage room, and then into a food preparation room, then into the heart of the longhouse where you would be sleeping, working along the side. There's a fireplace here down the middle. Regular everyday activities took place here, but this would also have been the place if this was a chieftain's establishment where things like politically motivated feasts would take place. A more publicly accessible, because this is another door, multi-purpose room is located here on the side. They probably kept a few animals in here as well. But if we zoom back out and look at the settlement altogether, you can see how big the longhouse is compared to the church. We've done some reconstructions to show you, and I just want to remind you that internally these houses look like Viking Age houses. They are mimicking in diasporic ways the houses that they were familiar with building. But then of course they have the innovation of the turf surrounding the house for insulation. We've done we tried to make a video game of this, although it was a little clunky, so kids don't like to play it. But it's a model and another way to experience these social places. I should point out that Alan Miller at St. Andrews Open Virtual Worlds Lab was responsible for helping us to make this. He did a wonderful job. And what you see there in the middle is the sort of products of a feast. And that's what I want to finish with, talking about the products of feasting, the political motivation. We've talked about kind of the opportunities and constraints on Christianity and ideological shifts and how that plays into a diasporic and new society perspective. Now I want to talk about political motivated feasting and how we see that. This is Karen Millick, and she helped us to sample all of the floors. She's at Durham. Within the longhouse, and there were many, over 200 floor layers. These Viking Age floors are made of soot and compacted ash that is purposefully redistributed from the hearth around the house to make a nice flat surface to walk on and easy to clean. But it's a gold mine of material that we can study to see what people were eating and what work they were doing within the house. So just a quick overview of what some artifacts we find within. There are things like loom weights. There are regular everyday things like whetstones made of schists, probably imported from Norway. There's a soapstone spindle whorl here. Then some evidence of small scale ironworking, nails and rivets and this sorts of thing that you would expect to find. But then also prestige goods that you might expect to find in a higher status farm, as this was supposed to be. So by letter A and letter D, you see evidence for trade and exchange. A is a lead weight, and D is a piece of hack silver. C and B are decorative items. So C is a ring, and B would have been thread on a necklace, both silver. Beautiful imported beads from as far away as the eastern shores of the Caspian Sea. Those on your right there, that looks like a bloodshot eye. That's those are beads from the late 10th century, kind of uniting, putting us back to that early map of the breadth of the Viking world, uniting this farmstead in Iceland with objects created in the Caspian Sea. Oops. We can do some comparisons between houses of the time. If we're going to talk about high status, low status, we should at least compare them to other houses. So if you see the third one down there is Rispru, and there you see the internal length, not the external, but the internal length of these houses. And what I think is that these top three here are of a different scale than the more modest ones down below. And that scale is borne out also in the imported materials like beads and metals. Each of those X's represents 10 beads. For instance, made of glass, we know those would be valuable. So I think what we're seeing here is, if you remember back to that governmental structure, that these are chieftains' establishments at the top, and then you have thingmen establishments below. If we look at what they were eating, pretty standard North Atlantic Viking fare here. They're eating fish. The fish are overrepresented because they were doing counts of bones here, so many more fish bones get counted. But they are eating fish. They're eating some birds, so they're supplementing their sedentary pastoral economies with hunting and gathering. They have mixed sheep, goat, and cattle farming, also standard, some marine mammal. What's interesting is if we look at the ratios of these types of animals, especially cattle bones to sheep and goat bones. Now, sheep and goats are easier to keep in Iceland in the North Atlantic, and cattle are harder. So this is Rispru here, and this is our farm. And what you see is a big ratio of cattle, many more cattle bones to sheep bones. So there's a focus there on cattle rather than sheep, which we believe mimics the elite diet profile from back home in Scandinavia. So again, sheep are easier to keep outside. Cattle really you have to keep them inside for the winter. And this is not from our site, but it's an interesting indication of the kind of social and political value of cattle. This is 23 cattle skulls that were found at the site of Hofstadr, excavated by Gavin Lucas and colleagues, that were mounted on the outside of this house. And they were sacrificed in a very specific way. They were killed in a very specific way. That's not standard butchering. They were decapitated while standing after having been stunned in the middle, as you see this cattle skull here, in the middle of the forehead by a blunt object. Would have created a very dramatic display, kind of a bloody display as the heart continues to pound. The blood would have spurted out, and this was, we think, connected to pagan worship and pagan sacrifice in the period. pre-Christianity was called bloat, which means blood, excuse me. They chose very large cattle to do this because of the display. I'm sorry. That tickle. And I believe there's even something cross-cultural about the showiness of sacrificing and eating the largest domestic animal that you have available culturally. For Vikings, this was their cattle. So I think they're products of a feast. I think they're putting on a show, both at our place and at Hofstad here. The other product of a feast is alcohol. The only alcohol available in the North Atlantic is barley made beer. So we floated all the floor layers of the house and came up with over 200 barley seeds that indicate consumption of barley. Barley is hard to grow this far north. So in my mind, they're doing it only as politically motivated feasting. Maybe in the beginning as part of regular subsistence economics, but I think it's an investment in political economics more than in subsistence economics. So if the seeds found within the longhouse indicates consumption, we were also interested in production of remains. So of course the whole framework of this type of feasting economy comes from the written sources we have left in the way that the Vikings structured their politics. And this will be second to last slide because I know we're up against our time here. This is a pollen diagram made by Egil Erlendsson from the University of Iceland, and it was taken from a core just below the Risbru farmhouse. Iceland again is marvelous because of these tephra layers. So volcanic eruptions leave volcanic layers uh, in strata in the soil. And if you look at the three layers here, the three dates, 871, 1226, and 1500, those are soil horizons indicating that underneath this layer, we're below 1500. Then here comes 1226, and we're below that. Then we're down to 871. One really fortunate thing about the 871 volcanic tephra layer is that it corresponds precisely with the settlement of Iceland around 870. So usually the first evidence of settlement we have right around this tephra layer. But what I want to show you is the different things picked up within this diagram. So first of all, microscopic charcoal on your far left indicates fertilization of the fields. So field fertility is pretty low this far north and needs to be fertilized if you're going to grow anything. So a spike in fertilization of the fields here. If we look at the green, we can see these are grazing sensitive taxa. So if you're grazing the area, then there'll be very low levels of grazing sensitive taxa. So what we can see here is that they're not grazing the areas around their farmstead. The blue shows the inverse. So if you're grazing, you're going to have higher levels of blue. I'll skip ahead to this cereal weed taxa. If you look at the whoredom type, that's barley seeds. So barley doesn't grow naturally in Iceland. It's imported with the Vikings. And look at this. It's just perfect, right? Right around the settlement of Iceland, we have an uptick in barley seeds. So we know right from the beginning they're planting barley. They're bringing this as part of their settlement package from their homelands. And then you have, yeah, more or less, we're registering barley up until right after 1226. And what we're showing here is around 1226, the cultivation of barley stops, the fertilization of fields stops, and they start grazing around their farms more frequently. What I think this charts is a shift away from politically motivated subsistence or planting barley that's invested in politics, focusing on cattle that's invested in politics, and then a shift back to to what maybe makes more sense subsistence-wise. Right around this time before 1226, we also see a disappearance in the textual records of the chieftains of the Mosfell Valley. So there's a correlation between what the texts are saying, the chiefs are no longer there, and what we're seeing in the archaeology as kind of what I would consider the backbone of their political economics. Zooming back out, we've done one more test to see if we could find more of this correlation. And so remember around Riesbru and Mosfell, there was a shift here. They moved the main farm from Riesbru to Mosfell. Originally, we think this whole area on the side of the mountain would have been part of one farm. And as more people settled, the farm splintered, which is what you can see here first into the green, then into the orange. There would have been probably three in terms of what the place names tell us and what the archaeology tells us. Three main early farms in Riesbru, Leerburg, Zongli, and Helgadale. What we wanted to see was, okay, if this is a chieftain's establishment that's focusing on barley, can we trace any cultivation of barley at the other farms, or is it really the preserve of the main farm in the valley? So we've done pollen sampling from the other farms in the area, and there is no barley pollen. So it does seem to us now that really only those southern slopes of the Mosfell Mountain were cultivated for barley, and we think that the decline in barley was corresponding with a decline in chiefly power and politics in the valley. And there, and hopefully we have a little time for questions. Thank you again to the Institute for Northern Studies and all of you listeners for hanging in there with me. And of course, thanks to all the people over the years who have helped dig in the Mosfell Valley.
Well, that is wonderful. Thank you very, very much for such a fascinating talk that just examined so many really, really interesting features of early settlement in Iceland. So, yes, we certainly do have time for questions. And if I could ask people to either type them in the chat or hold your hand, put your hand up. And just when I'm waiting for people to kind of formulate their thoughts, if I might start things off, I'm really interested in the your what you've been saying about the. You seem very convinced about the 870 as absolutely the start point, and what I assume from the way you were describing this is that you are unconvinced by the various little bitty tentative arguments that have been made for certain slightly earlier sites. Would that be fair? Do you think that really Norse settlement starts absolutely in 870 and there's nothing a little bit before that in the decades before?
It's a good question. So, for one, the layer, the Lantnum layer from 871 plus or minus 2 has been redated to 877, pushing the date up a little bit after that graphic was found. We do have at least one structure that I am happy with. It's in the downtown Reykjavik that pretty clearly predates the fall of the Lantnum Tefra. So there's something going on at least by 870 or a couple of years before. There have been arguments made about even a migration period settlement in the Vestman Eyre and the carbon dating there. I'm not convinced of that. I don't think there's enough. Now, it would be foolish, I think, for me to suggest we'll never find anything earlier. I think that the texts about Irish monks being up there, I think is that's believable. We just don't have any archaeological evidence. We don't have any scientific analysis, let's say, of affecting the pollen signals or anything like that in the area. I would love to see that, and I think they were there. They just had a very small footprint. I think the Irish monks who may have been there, but the texts are convinced that they were there. So but let's say the big settlement, the mass migration to Iceland happens after 870. I'm confident of that.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Thanks very, very much for that. And I can see hands are starting to go up now. So first we'll go to Stefan Brink.
Hi, Stefan.
Oh, sorry. I think I need to. Apologies, Stefan. I have to use my untold admin power to both allow you to be seen and to speak. So hopefully you should be able to. Both of those should apply now. Um, sorry, can you unmute and if you wish,
Oh, is it? I
show
have to do
yourself?
that?
No, no, no. You don't have to do that. I
Hello,
think.
David.
Hi,
Yep.
Stefan.
Yeah. Excellent. Good to see you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, this is really interesting. It's really. While you're talking, there's so many things that pop up in your head, the whole and these kind of things. But I have two questions. One specific regarding this termination of the barley, so to say.
Yeah.
You give it a political kind of explanation.
Yeah.
Did the little ice age influence Iceland in a way that it could be used as a argument, or is it too obvious that it's a clear cut for you? So that doesn't matter. But the really interesting question for me is, of course, this duality between Risbro and Mosfell.
Yeah.
Both church places. And I'm thinking, of course, about the Staðarmál, in the 11th or 12th century, were both these places a staðr? Or have you looked into Mosfell if there are any older churches, so to say? Have you looked at that place if there are any earlier construction, settlement structure or whatever? Because the names are so not strange, but one would assume that Mosfell could be the oldest place here. Then it would be like in Norway and Sweden, so to say. A first settlement in a valley is normally takes the name of the valley. However, we know, of course, also especially from Sweden, that we have atypical names for the original hub, so to say, which Risbro, of course, smells, so to say.
Right.
And then you have the Staðir name there, which fits into the picture that the traditional picture of Staðir name in Iceland as a kind of a secondary expansion. Early ones, probably 10th century. But this duality with Mosfell and Risbro, can you expand on that?
Yes, I'll take the easy one first. Okay. The let's do this one first. Yes, I mean it got cold and it got harder to grow the grains, and that's kind of the classic explanation. I see the disappearance of barley predating the Little Ice Age
Yeah.
by a bit. So that's why I think there's something political going on. It's not just it got cold and they stopped. So I think there's something, it got cold and it got harder and harder. You know, I think it was already hard. It's probably getting harder. And it's really only the elite, the really big farmsteads that can afford to invest the amount of energy it takes to keep barley growing. And we know, you know, by the time the Little Ice Age is at its max, those elites guys, you know, that are of the ruling class or importing malt from Scandinavia. They really want to continue to have this aura of being the chieftain. So I think they're playing together. This environment getting colder, and maybe further centralization within Iceland itself. So chieftains getting fewer and fewer, right? But fewer that can actually monopolize these sources. But for this case, I think it's political. I really think that it's a little too early for that. Okay, so the harder one. Okay, I knew you were gonna like this place names stuff. So I'm in total agreement. I like the model. As you point out, the big landscape features give the name to the primary farm. So I think Mosfell is the name of the first farm. There's two other kind of big landscape names that could be primary, which I suggest this map here. Leirvogstunga originally was just Tunga. And Helgadalr is next to Helgafell, the holy mountain. That also has a big landscape name. So these are big landscape names that that perhaps indicate their primary settlements. I think then what comes in next, as you also point out, Stefan, is Isustad, Radastad, and Skekkjestad are these 10th century secondary splinter farms that splinter off the primary farms. I think all three of those splinter from Mosfell, and that it's indicative. They all have personal names, right? So Skekkjestad is Skekki's place. Radastadr is Radi's place. Isustadr is Isa's place. Interesting that that's a female, right? Who's giving her own farmstead there in more marginal lands than the original Mosfell farm. So why this Riesbrued Mosfell? By putting the archaeology and the text together, I think the correct conclusion is originally the name Mosfell was used for the farm that is where Riesbru is today. And that's why, these farms like Grimmer and Unnen, they're described as chieftains of Mosfell, right? So that the valley's named Mosfell, the mountain's named Mosfell, the heath above it is named, everything's named Mosfell, including the chieftains. So that the power of the individual tied to the landscape, everything. So that works really well for me. But and the saga says, they built the church earlier, Grim of Mosfell, implying that he's of Mosfell, built a church at a place called Riesbru. Why build a church at a small place? He should build it at his main farm. And then he moved it to his new farm place, which is just a couple hundred meters, to the east. So I think when the boss man, right, when Grim moved his farm slightly, for whatever reason that I don't understand, he moved it a couple hundred meters away, the place name moves with the chieftain.
Yes.
So of course the seat of the chieftain is now the same name that it always had, and then you have a tertiary name, something that's like a habitative, right? Riesbru is the bridge is already built, so it's named after a bridge that's already there. That takes it's a much smaller farm at that point. Probably they're splintering it and giving it to a follower or somebody else to farm at Riesbru, while the boss is now at Mosfell. That's my best guess using the sources that are available, but also the fact that the palynology shows barley cultivation all along that slope.
Yeah.
Both at Riesbru and Mosfell, kind of indicates that whole southern slope of the Mosfell mountain was the home field, the productive home field of the chieftain at Mosfell.
Sounds very plausible. And you actually have cases in Scandinavia where you have the kind of name transfer for the central place a short bit beside. So yeah, sounds really plausible to me.
Oh, thank God. Okay.
Excellent. Have you and Jesse agreed on the burial of Egil yet?
No, we haven't agreed. We're both romantics, but he takes the cake,
Thank you.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you very much, both of you, Stefan, for the wonderful questions, and Davide for the really extensive answers that was really interesting. An entirely different question now. I've gotten the text there, and this is from Meg Stockley, who says, "Thank you, that was amazing. I'm currently doing my master's archaeology dissertation on Viking Age Iceland, and I wondered what specific areas require more research in your opinion." I imagine you've probably got a list, Davide, but do you have any specific suggestions?
Wow. Well, there's a lot. If it's the Viking Age, I think the first farms of the settlement are really interesting. I would love myself to dig at Skekkjestad. The texts. Now we're going back into place names, like what Stefan was talking about. Skekkjestad, the name for Skekki. The Landnama book tells us that Skekki was the first person to settle this landscape, and he built a farm at Skekkjestad. It doesn't make any sense the location doesn't make any sense. The name doesn't make any sense. A lot of things don't make any sense. So there, I think the text, we have going back to the three arenas, we have a contradictory text and archaeology situation here. And the place name's also contradicted. That wouldn't be the name of the first site. So we don't believe that, but we've located some remains there at Skekkjestad from an early period, probably 10th century. All that to say, that's where, if I could choose our next goal here, but now I'm digging in Italy for a while before we go back to Iceland eventually. But that's probably the place I would target. And the reason is, going back to the question about what remains to be done, I think the very earliest phase of settlement still really needs more research. What happens when they first settle the landscape? A lot has been done. A lot of Viking Age archaeology has been done in Iceland. Most of it tends to be 10th centuries, you know? And so the earliest ones we're not quite seeing. And I think some weird stuff goes on in the earliest settlement, where you see some people living together, longhouses closer together. Only have a couple windows in this. Kind of more like if you were familiar with Lanza Meadows, the site of Lanza Meadows, which has three longhouses located very, very close to each other. It's not a situation in this dispersed settlement pattern that is common in the North Atlantic. So I think we could find evidence of cooperation early on and different settlement structure. So I'd love to see more work on that. And then I only offer one more, and that is the 100 years or so after Christianization, that I like to think of as a syncretic period of hybridization. I think that's another area that I would love to see more work being done on. Now, if you expand beyond the Viking Age, Icelandic archaeologists now would probably mostly tell you we've focused too much on the Viking Age. We have too many other periods of Icelandic history that needs archaeological excavation and research, and I'm sure that's correct, but our field's the Viking Age, so I want to stay focused on that.
That's wonderful, and yeah, I'm sure that's a lot of food for thought for Meg. And oh yeah, you've replied there saying thank you. That was really helpful. So thanks very much for that question, Meg, and again thank you for the answer. We've got time for a couple more questions, and I do see that there's a couple of hands up there. So first of all is Claire Stokes, and if you just let me allow you permission to speak, you can hopefully now speak to us, Claire, and if you want, you can be seen as well. But over to you. If you
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. Thank you, David. That was super interesting. Just following on from your point about the earliest sort of days of the settlement period, a couple of things really struck me when you showed the map of all of the settlements, the 400 plus sort of farms around the coastal area, and thinking about your point about the challenges of the environment. And I guess what was just going through my mind was just how fragile an existence was it if you've got sort of all of a sudden 400 farms. I know it's still a big area, but you know, how tenuous is your what's your chance of survival when you kind of in those earliest days before things have got in any way established? Or do you think they kind of were tough enough to kind of get there and make a go of it right from the get-go?
Oh, it's a good question. I think about that often. I mean, if you just go outside and stand in the environment in Iceland for, an hour in the middle of the winter, you go, what would you need to set up here to survive one of these winters? And I think it was tenuous. And I think that part of the reason that Iceland remains really conservative in terms of their economics and politics, once they get it set up, is because a little variation off of the general practices, any innovation could be dangerous. And there's actually lots of political structures that are kind of set in place that prevent people from even going down and trying to live in towns or villages down by the coast, because then they're going to end up failing and being poor, and then everybody else has to take care of them. So you have to have a farmstead as your primary residence. This comes in later, so there's lots of structures put in place that I find interesting. Speaking of the time of when they first get there, there's actually some great accounts in the Book of Settlements about the first people who come there, and one of them is Raven Floki, and he thinks it looks great. Right? He settles in the West Fjords, and he doesn't prepare for the winter, and they starve, and there's ice everywhere. And when the summer comes around, they flee. And he's the one who names it Iceland because it's so icy, it's almost unlivable, right? And then there's a one of his crew that I'm remembering. What's his name? It's I call him Thorolf Butter. Thorolf Butter has a different view. He says, no. Iceland, if you prepare correctly, it's like there's butter dripping from every blade of grass. Right? So for one, it's a nice story about not all of these ventures would have been successful. And I think it took some time. We see the successes in the long term after these 60 years, but I think it would have been very difficult. And I think this would have been some hardy people that were up there. But also finding that delicate way to prepare for the unexpected winter, that it's going to be longer than the one you had at home. But yet there's all this available land that if you do it correctly, you really can claim a large territory for yourself, and you're supportive. So a guy like Thorolf Butter, who would plan it and think it out, it's hard for us to get those personal stories a lot from the archaeology, but I think it's something that we should think more about for sure.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Thank you again very much for both the question and the answer. And we do have time for one more question. And I can see we have Stefan Boge Svensson has got a hand up. So if you just let me allow you to speak, then hopefully you can now unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. There are so many interesting things that have been said, and one of the most interesting, I think, is what Davide mentioned here about the maybe a little bit strange stuff that probably took place very early on during the settlement, and the need to take a closer look at the sort of the 9th century things, because things probably developed, and it also made me the question about what needs to be researched. It really spoke to me, because there are certain sites in Iceland that have clear indications of a settlement era. Well, some indications of settlement that are not mentioned by the Book of Settlements, and I think those are particularly interesting, because maybe the idea is that the Book of Settlement is actually describing more so things that were happening a little bit later. So yes, if Meg wants to come and do research in East Iceland, where I live, I can point out some fabulous spots to do research on. But sorry, but my question was about pollen analysis, and if you've taken a look at birds and sort of tried to see how the forest has developed, because there are some really interesting things that I imagine that you can see about sort of how the settlement evolves as the forest is retreating, the early forest that the Book of Settlement describes that was there. So I was wondering if that's something that you've taken a look at in the Mosfell Valley. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I'm sure you know, but maybe the others don't, there's been a lot of discussion about the birch forest that's described in the Book of Settlements as reaching from the coast to the foot of the mountains. And the birch pollen research done by Hallsdotter back starting in the 80s supported that largely, that there's a large birch forest that is eliminated, chopped down, destroyed for a variety of reasons, probably clearing land for animals, making iron, building houses. So it does look like the pollen signal indicates that there were birch forests. Some other research lately has suggested the birch forest was already in retreat when the Vikings showed up, meaning that maybe the Viking Age settlers are not the only ones to blame for the retreating birch forest. There's also other indications that they don't deforest the landscape quite as quickly, and that they maintain certain stands of birch forest in different areas around Iceland. So those are considerations. In our specific valley, we do see that. And actually, I had an image that I took out. Now I'm sort of wishing I had it somewhere in my PowerPoint. But it's of down below the farm, a profile into the wetlands where before the settlement tephra is very clear. And before the settlement tephra, there's pieces of birch wood. So even some roots within the soil, and the soil is this nice brown, darkish brown layer. Then after the settlement layer, you have a little bit of dark still, but then very, very quickly, way before 1226, which is the next tephra layer we have, the soil turns light brown from Aeolian sediments blown from the highlands, and there's no forest cover anymore, so none of that organic material at all. So I can say within the Mosfell Valley, we see extensive deforestation based on the archaeological evidence that we've seen, and also based on pollen diagrams. Decrease in birch. Decrease in birch. Does that answer your question, Stefan?
That's excellent. So, yeah, thank you everybody for all of the really interesting questions, and a massive thank you again to Davide for such a fascinating way to spend an evening. Thoroughly enjoyed that, and I would urge everybody to go and have a look at his book as well, which is a equally fascinating read, and really goes into such great detail about such an intriguing period of history. So thank you very much to you as well, everybody who has come to watch. I'll just draw your attention before we go to some upcoming sessions. So the next session in a month's time is Frank Rennie, who's going to be talking about Among the Layers of the Land. So a rather intriguing title there. Then we have in April Paul Mulgrati of Institute for Northern Studies. With a title that's there to trip up all but most tongue twister proof individuals. The Caledonian Anticisygy, Origins, Legacy and Solutions, a Paradox. So another fascinating sounding paper. And then in May we have Dr. Adam Grimshaw, who will be talking about British merchants, Swedish trades, and the foundation of colonial power. So quite a diverse range of papers coming up. From next month onwards, you will be back in the hands of Andrew for the who will be chairing the session. So that just leaves me to say thank you very much again to our speaker. Thank you to everybody asking questions, and thank you to everybody listening. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of the evening.
Thank you.
Take care.
Good to see you, Stefan.